Have you ever noticed, the quieter you became, the more uncomfortable they got? Toxic people don't fear your anger. They fear your silence. Not because silence is empty, but because silence means you see everything, and you owe them nothing. You stopped arguing. You stopped explaining. You stopped defending yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. And suddenly, the power shifted. This video isn't about loud revenge. It's about 8 silent behaviors that make toxic people nervous, insecure, and deeply unsettled, not through aggression, but through quiet control, emotional intelligence, and unshakable self-worth. Listen carefully, because once you develop these behaviors, you won't need to raise your voice. Your presence will do all the talking. And the people who once underestimated you will learn to respect you in silence. Toxic people feed on reactions. They need chaos to feel in control. They push buttons, provoke arguments, twist words, and wait, hoping you explode. Panic, defend, justify. Because the moment you react emotionally, they win leverage. They now know exactly where to poke next time. But then something changes. One day, you stop reacting. You don't take the bait. You don't fight to be understood. You don't rush to fix what they break. Instead, you observe, quietly, calmly, like someone who finally sees the game for what it is. And this terrifies them, because silence forces them to face themselves without distraction. No drama to hide behind. No emotional storm to manipulate. No reaction to feed on. Just your eyes, watching. When you observe instead of react, you shift the dynamic from emotional combat, psychological chess. You're no longer predictable, no longer controllable, no longer moved by their theatrics. And a toxic person cannot stand a battlefield where you refuse to bleed. They say something disrespectful, you don't snap. They try to guilt trip, you don't justify. They provoke you, blink slowly instead of breaking. And in that moment, they realize the version of you they could control no longer exists. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." Stoicism isn't about being emotionless, it's about being unprovokable. It's about choosing response over reaction, presence over panic, clarity over chaos. Silent observation is a weapon, not to hurt, but to see clearly. Because when you stop reacting, patterns appear. You start noticing what triggers them, what they fear losing, how they use guilt or pity, where the insecurity leaks through, which words they use to control the room. You learn the terrain of the battlefield without ever stepping into it. And toxic people hate this. Not because you're aggressive, but because you're aware. Control slips through their fingers when you stop dancing to their emotional music. Your silence forces them to confront the one thing they avoid most, your emotional independence. Nothing scares a manipulative person more than someone they can no longer manipulate. When you observe instead of react, you look unpredictable. You look stronger than their tactics. You look like someone who's done explaining. You look like someone who could walk away at any moment. That's power. Not loud, not flashy. Quiet, heavy, felt. They start asking themselves, Did they figure me out? Why aren't they reacting? Why does their silence feel louder than my words? What are they thinking? What if they don't need me anymore? And the truth is, you don't. Observation is the first step of transformation. It's the shift from their power over you, your power over yourself. From reacting emotionally, responding strategically, from being controlled, becoming untouchable. It's the moment they realize you are no longer playing checkers. You are playing chess. Remember this: the person who reacts is controlled. The person who observes is in control. And once you master stillness under pressure, toxic people don't know what to attack because your peace has no handle. You don't beat them by being louder. You beat them by being unmoved. Toxic people fear silence, not because it's empty, but because they can't decode it. They are comfortable when you ramble, explain, overshare, justify, because the more you speak, the more data they gather. Every word becomes a weapon. Every explanation becomes leverage. Every secret becomes ammunition. But then you shift. You stop giving them access to your inner world. You stop narrating every feeling. You stop defending every decision. You stop needing to be understood. Instead, you speak less, but each word lands like stone, short, precise, final. It's shocking how uncomfortable people become when you no longer fill silence with nervous explanations, when you don't rush to validate yourself, when you answer with clarity instead of paragraphs. Them, why didn't you respond? You, I didn't need to. Them, do you have something to say? You, no. Them, are you upset? You, I'm aware. They expected emotional paragraphs. You gave them a sentence, and that sentence made them replay the conversation in their head for hours. Because silence forces them to deal with something terrifying, the realization that they no longer have access to your mind. The less you speak, the more they wonder, what are they thinking? Did they see through me? Why didn't they react? Are they planning something? When you speak with calm minimalism, you communicate power without shouting. You become unpredictable, and unpredictability is threatening. Toxic people can fight loudness, but they cannot fight ambiguity. They can only attack what they can measure. A quiet person with strong boundaries is impossible to manipulate. This is the principle toxic personalities hate most. Loud people want attention. Silent people already hold it. When you reduce unnecessary talking, you create psychological distance. They feel it immediately, like you just built a wall without raising your voice. Your silence communicates restraint, authority, and self-control. It says, I don't need to prove myself. My peace is not up for negotiation. Your discomfort is not my problem. I am listening. I am thinking. I am choosing. Seneca wrote, I judge you unfortunate because you have never lived without witnesses. Meaning, if you can't stand in quiet by yourself, you are not truly strong. Silence is a mirror. Toxic people avoid mirrors because your silence makes them see themselves flaws. Manipulation. Insecurity without distraction. They fear what your stillness reveals. And here's the twist: the less you speak, the more powerful your voice becomes when you finally do. A single sentence from a person who rarely speaks has the weight of thunder. People lean in. People pay attention. Even your no becomes a complete speech by itself. Minimal words. Maximum gravity. This behavior is not coldness, it is emotional intelligence. You're not depriving communication. You're protecting it from being wasted. You're conserving energy for what matters. You're choosing substance over noise. Toxic people can't stand this because their power relied on your emotional availability. They thrived when you overshared. They fed on your vulnerability. But now there is nothing to feed on. They don't know what you know. They don't know what you feel. They don't know what you'll do next. Mystery is power. Silence creates mystery. And mystery breeds fear. This is why kings spoke little. This is why generals measured their words. This is why the wisest people in history chose silence over unnecessary speech. Not because they had nothing to say, but because not everything deserves to be heard. When you speak less, you become harder to manipulate. You stop giving people tools to hurt you. You force others to reveal themselves first. You control the rhythm of interaction. You elevate your presence from loud to felt. You don't need to dominate rooms with volume. Your energy does that without effort. You become the one people watch, the one they study, the one they cannot predict. And unpredictability is intimidating, especially to those who once felt entitled to your reactions. Remember, weakness argues. Strength states. Weakness explains. Strength chooses silence. Weakness fears misunderstanding. Strength knows truth needs no approval. When you speak less but mean more, your silence becomes a sword not to harm, but to create respect without violence. You show them that you no longer operate from emotion, but from clarity. And toxic people don't fear your voice. They fear the moment you stop offering it freely. One of the most unsettling things you can do to a toxic person is to stop explaining yourself. Because explanation is not just communication, it's a form of submission. When you over-explain, you are saying, please understand me. Please approve me. Please don't misjudge me. And toxic people feed on that desire. They twist it, stretch it, use it to control your emotions. Because as long as you feel the need to justify your choices, they feel superior. But one day, something shifts. You realize your decisions don't require their permission. Your boundaries don't need negotiation. Your values don't need defending. Your peace is not up for debate. So you stop explaining. You state what you will do, and you do it. No justification. No emotional essay. No desperate attempt to be seen as reasonable. And that silence, it rattles them. Because now they must face a truth they never prepared for. You don't need their validation anymore. When you stop explaining, you communicate a message louder than any argument. My life is mine. Let's break down why this terrifies toxic personalities. They lose control over your guilt. Guilt is their favorite weapon. They push the narrative. If you cared, you'd explain. If you were honest, you'd defend yourself. If you're innocent, you'd prove it. But you've learned something powerful. Innocence doesn't beg to be believed. Truth doesn't chase acceptance. Your calm refusal to justify becomes untouchable. When they accuse you, you respond Simply, you're free to think what you want. 5 words and the fight dies, because there's no room to attack someone who refuses the battlefield. They can no longer gaslight you. Toxic people rewrite your memory using confusion. That never happened. You're too sensitive. You're overreacting. But when you stop arguing about what you lived, the manipulation collapses. You no longer need to prove reality. You know what you saw. You trust your intuition. The moment you stop trying to convince them, they lose the power to distort you. You become unpredictable, and unpredictability is fear. When you explain everything, they can anticipate you, predict you, control your emotional logic. But when you stop revealing your reasoning, you become unreadable. They ask, "Why did you do that?" You say, "It was the right choice for me." No details, no openings, no handles to grab. A closed door is more terrifying than an open conflict. You break the trauma bond. Many people stay stuck in toxic dynamics, not because they lack strength, but because they crave being understood. You stop trying to be understood, and suddenly you're free. Not because the situation changed, but because you stopped needing closure from the one who broke you. That is liberation at the soul level. You choose peace over proving your point. Stoics understood this deeply. The need to explain is ego. The ability to walk away without defending is mastery. You realize you don't have to win every argument. You don't need to correct every misunderstanding. You don't have to make them see your heart. Sometimes silence is the highest form of self-respect. Because every minute spent explaining yourself to someone committed to misjudging you is emotional debt paid to the wrong bank. When you stop explaining, people notice. Some will respect you more. Some will panic. Some will accuse you of being cold. Some will say, "You've changed." But the truth is, you finally return to yourself. This behavior doesn't mean you're unkind. It means you've outgrown the need for external permission. When you stop explaining your boundaries, they become boundaries. When you stop explaining your worth, it becomes self-evident. When you stop explaining your decisions, they become powerful. You become someone who moves with intention, not insecurity. And toxic people fear that because nothing is harder to manipulate than a mind that no longer needs to defend its choices. Remember this: you owe clarity to God. You owe peace to yourself. You owe explanation to no one who cannot receive truth with respect. And the moment you learn to say, "This is my decision," it's final. "I don't need you to understand," is the moment you step into quiet authority. You stop trying to be understood and you start being respected. There is a kind of power that requires no threats, no shouting, no dramatic exit, the power of walking away quietly, not slamming doors, not sending final paragraphs, not begging to be understood, just standing up and leaving with your peace intact. Toxic people don't fear losing you during an argument. They fear the moment you stop arguing at all, because anger still means you're involved. Silence means you're done. When you walk away calmly, you communicate something they never expected. You no longer need their approval, attention, or chaos to feel whole. You're not leaving out of weakness, you're leaving because you finally see the truth. You're not retreating, you're graduating. You're not escaping, you're evolving. And nothing is more unsettling to someone who relied on your emotional reactions than a goodbye spoken without sound. Calm walking away means emotional detachment. They were used to the version of you who stayed, negotiated, explained, hoped. They were comfortable knowing you cared enough to fight for the connection. But one day, something inside shifts. You stop proving your worth. You stop trying to change what refuses to change. You stop sacrificing your peace for the privilege of being misunderstood. You simply walk away. No warning, no breakdown, no spectacle, just a steady exit. Toxic people expect you to crumble. They expect tears, confrontation, closure. But when you leave without a scene, you create the one thing they can't control: silence. Silence is the aftermath of awakening. You deny them the drama they feed on. Manipulators need emotional reaction to stay relevant. They provoke so you'll explode. They twist so you'll defend. They push so you'll chase. Drama is their oxygen. Attention is their fuel. And when you walk away without engaging, you cut the supply. No reaction to feed on. No chaos to control. No emotional dialogue to spin. You don't slam the door, you just stop standing in it. That's what shakes them. Because a calm departure is not a response, it's a verdict. Your silence forces accountability. Words can be argued with. Silence cannot. When you stop explaining why you're leaving, they are left alone with their behavior. No one to blame. No one to debate with. No one to guilt. Just themselves and the consequences they created. Your absence becomes a mirror. They can either face it or drown in it. And many do drown. Not because they miss you, but because losing access to you means losing power. Walking away is self-worth in motion. You're not leaving to punish them. You're leaving to protect you. You realize you don't need to prove loyalty to someone who abuses it. You don't need to shrink to be tolerated. You don't need to bleed to keep peace. When you walk away calmly, you say without speaking, "I know my value now, and I refuse to bargain with it." Strength is not staying and breaking. Strength is leaving and healing. Boundaries don't need speeches. Only action. Your exit breaks the illusion of control. Toxic people assume they can pull you back whenever they want with guilt, fear, flattery, or chaos. But when you walk away and don't return, their entire perception collapses. They finally understand you didn't stay because you were stuck. You stayed because you had hope. And you left the moment your growth outgrew your hope. That realization burns deeper than any revenge could. Because nothing terrifies a controlling person more than someone they can no longer control. Walking away is not weakness. It is clarity. It is emotional maturity. It is the highest expression of self-respect. You don't win by outshouting them. You win by outgrowing them. You don't prove your worth through struggle. You prove it through distance. And here's the paradox. They understand your value the most, the moment they no longer have access to it. Not because you punished them, but because you stopped performing for an audience of one. That's the kind of power that keeps people awake at night. Not the power of force, but the power of absence. Not the power of revenge, but the power of release. When you walk away with calm confidence, you don't break the connection, you dissolve it. And the silence left behind says everything they never wanted to hear. You lost someone you thought would never leave. Toxic people don't fear rules, they fear boundaries backed by silence. Because a rule can be negotiated, debated, tested. A boundary quietly enforced is a wall they cannot climb. Most people try to protect themselves through arguments explaining why something hurt them, convincing the other person to respect them, hoping logic or empathy will change behavior. But a toxic person is not moved by logic, they are moved by limits. And when you finally learn to set boundaries without justifying, defending, or begging, you become someone they cannot drain. They say, "You're overreacting." You say, "This doesn't work for me." They say, "You're so sensitive." You say, "I decide how I'm treated." They say, "Why are you being distant?" You say, "I choose where my energy goes." No debate. No emotional essay. No need for approval. Just a boundary stated clearly. Enforced quietly. Because a boundary that needs defending is not a boundary. A boundary that stands on its own becomes law. Boundaries without argument signal self-respect. When you stop fighting to make someone treat you right, and instead remove access when they don't, you shift from reaction to regulation. You are no longer trying to earn respect through persuasion. You are demonstrating respect through action. A toxic person expects pushback. They expect you to plead. They expect you to bend. But when you enforce a boundary calmly, without anger, they realize they have no leverage. You cannot negotiate with someone who has already decided their worth. Silence after a boundary is more powerful than a speech. People reveal themselves when you stop explaining. Tell them, "This is my limit," then watch. Do they adjust, or do they get angry? Do they respect it, or do they try to break it? A boundary exposes character faster than conflict ever could. If they get defensive, guilt trip you, call you selfish good, now you have information you couldn't see before. Silent enforcement gives clarity. They either step up or step out. Either result is peace. Toxic people fear consequences, not conversations. You don't need to threaten. You don't need to yell. You don't need to prove anything. The deepest form of boundary is simply access changes when behavior does. You stop replying instantly. You stop being available on demand. You stop giving second, third, 10th chances. You stop forgiving without growth. And suddenly, they panic not because you're angry, but because you're no longer interested. Attention is a currency. You stopped spending it carelessly. That is power. Quiet boundaries break emotional manipulation. When boundary setting is loud, they know how to fight. When it is calm, they don't know where to strike. Arguing gives them openings. They can gaslight, deflect, guilt trip, minimize. But when you say, "I don't allow this," and then mirror it with action, the manipulation has nowhere to land. Because boundaries are not about controlling them. They're about controlling your access to them. You don't force them to change. You simply refuse to remain where you are diminished. You're not at war, you're just done bleeding. Boundaries upgrade your aura. Something shifts in how you move, how you speak, how you value your time. People feel it before you even say a word. You are no longer desperate for approval, no longer available for chaos, no longer addicted to being needed. Your energy says, I am open to respect, unavailable for disrespect. And this unsettles the toxic mindset, because they can't push you, can't provoke you, can't guilt you back into submission. You're no longer a hostage to emotional expectations. You've evolved, and evolution intimidates those who refuse to grow. Not arguing makes them face themselves. When you don't debate, they must look inward. Most won't, they'll blame you. But even that reveals truth. Some people loved you more when you lacked boundaries. Some people valued you more when you tolerated pain. Some people respected your silence only when it meant suffering, not power. And when you finally protect your peace, they call it attitude. When you enforce respect, they call it distance. When you stop overgiving, they call it selfishness. But that's not your burden, because boundaries are not walls, they are doors with selective access. Not everyone gets a key. Setting boundaries without arguing is the moment you stop trying to be liked and begin choosing to be respected. You speak less. You react less. You allow less. And everything you allow becomes intentional. Toxic people don't fear your anger. They fear the day your kindness grows a spine. Not loud, not reactive, just undeniable. When you draw a boundary and stand by it silently, you teach others how to treat you not through words, but through what you no longer tolerate. And that is when your presence stops being accessible and starts being valuable. One of the most intimidating things about a person who has healed is this: they no longer crave company, they curate it. They don't chase connections, they filter them. Toxic people fear the moment you become selective, not because you become arrogant, but because you stop being accessible. You no longer see everyone as deserving of access. You start choosing based on energy, values, behavior, consistency, not history, not guilt, not loneliness. And that shift is powerful, because when you finally understand your worth, you stop sitting at tables where love comes with conditions, where respect has to be earned through pain, where loyalty is one-sided. Instead, you protect your inner circle like a kingdom. Entry is not a right, it's a privilege. You stop seeking validation from the crowd. There was a time when approval felt necessary, when acceptance mattered, when being liked meant being safe. But growth changes appetite. You no longer need a room full of people. You need a room full of quality. You stop performing, stop pleasing, stop diluting your strength to keep others comfortable. You'd rather stand alone in truth than be surrounded in pretense. And that kind of independence terrifies toxic individuals because their power lived in your need. The moment you no longer need their acceptance, you become uncontrollable. You judge people by patterns, not apologies. Words used to convince you, now you wait and watch. A boundary crossed once is a lesson. Crossed twice is a decision. Crossed 3 times is disrespect. No more excuses, like they didn't mean it. They're just stressed. Maybe it will get better. You no longer fall for potential, you evaluate reality. You don't cut people off impulsively. You detach gradually, quietly, naturally, the same way you heal without announcement, without noise. You simply stop giving energy to what drains you, and that silent discernment unsettles manipulators because apologies can no longer buy re-entry. Access must be earned through behavior, not words. You choose depth over popularity. Not everyone deserves to know your soul. Not everyone deserves access to your mind, your plans, your vulnerability. You've learned that some just want proximity to your light, but not accountability to your value. So you become intentional. You keep plans private until they bloom. You protect your ideas from envy. You share your heart only with those who can hold it carefully. You stop giving loyalty to those who offer convenience. Not commitment. You don't isolate, you elevate. And elevation is naturally selective. Because the higher you go, the fewer people can breathe at that altitude. This is why your circle shrinks, not because you push people away, but because not everyone can go where you're going. You make decisions based on peace, not pressure. You no longer say yes out of guilt. You no longer attend rooms that drain you. You no longer stay where you're tolerated instead of valued. Your compass is peace. If being around someone brings anxiety, tension, self-doubt, you distance. If their presence feels heavy, you detach. If you must shrink to fit, you leave. No explanation, no drama, no announcement. You simply protect peace like it's oxygen. Because once you've experienced peace, chaos becomes too expensive. Your standards make small minds insecure. People who benefit from your lack of boundaries call your growth attitude. People who thrived when you were naive call your standards ego. People who used you call your distance cold. Let them talk. You're not rude, you're refined. You're not distant, you're discerning. You're not hard, you're healed. You don't need everyone to understand you. You're not building a crowd. You're building a kingdom where respect is currency. Loyalty is sacred. Energy is filtered. And access is earned. You choosing your circle carefully sends one silent message. Not everyone deserves a seat at my table anymore. Not because you think you're better, but because you worked too hard rebuilding yourself to hand your peace back to the same hands that shattered it. Your silence, your standards, your selectiveness, they are not walls. They are gates. And you are the gatekeeper now. A toxic person fears that moment more than any confrontation. Because the game changes when you stop asking to be included and start choosing where you belong. You no longer seek souls to complete you, only those who match the frequency you've grown into. That's the power of evolution. Calm, quiet, selective, unshakable. There comes a moment in your evolution when something subtle but powerful happens. You stop being readable. Not because you're hiding, but because you no longer operate from insecurity, impulse, or emotional exposure. Your silence becomes strategy. Your movements become unpredictable. Your energy becomes hard to access and even harder to influence. And nothing makes toxic people more uneasy than someone they can't control, can't trigger, and can't predict. You reveal nothing, yet say everything through your actions. People once knew your reactions. They could push the right button, poke the right wound, and get a response. But not anymore. Now, when they expect anger, you stay calm. Expect explanation, you give none. Expect reaction, they get silence. You no longer explain your choices. You no longer justify your boundaries. You no longer narrate your healing journey for validation. You move quietly, independently, purposefully, and they watch. Confused, threatened, curious, because unpredictability removes their leverage. When people can't anticipate your moves, they can't manipulate them. You stop oversharing and start observing. You used to announce your dreams, your plans, your pain. You used to hand people the blueprint to your vulnerabilities. You used to believe transparency meant connection. But growth teaches discernment. Now you speak less and study more. You listen to what people don't say. You catch tone, energy, micro-behaviors. You're no longer desperate to be understood. You're patient enough to understand others first. A toxic mind can't stand a quiet observer. They thrive in chaos, in reaction, in emotional exposure. But you've learned to protect your inner world like a hidden temple, guarded, sacred, exclusive. Not everyone gets access to your depth anymore. You move without validation or permission. When you make a decision, you act. When you feel called, you pivot. When a door closes, you don't beg, you build another one. You no longer wait for applause to believe in yourself. You no longer delay purpose to avoid disappointing others. You no longer need a crowd to prove the path is real. You trust your inner compass, that quiet voice forged through pain, reflection, and emotional intelligence. And when someone can't predict your next step, they lose the power to block it. Your moves become like chess, silent, calculated, inevitable. Your absence speaks louder than your presence ever could. There was a time you would argue, defend, explain. Now you withdraw. Not in weakness, but in strategy. You've learned that leaving the room is sometimes louder than raising your voice. That disappearing is often the most powerful response. That peace is the sharpest sword. When you remove access, people feel it. When you stop chasing, they panic. When you no longer feed a dynamic, it dies. This is the silent consequence of evolution, not revenge, but replacement. Because nothing humbles a toxic person like realizing they no longer have access to the version of you they could control. Your unpredictability makes them watch you in silence. They check your stories. They monitor your growth. They wonder how you're doing so well without them. Not because you're showing off, but because you're thriving quietly. You post less but live more. You speak less but know more. You appear less but matter more. Unpredictability is not chaos, it's controlled mystery. The less they know, the more they think. The more they think, the more they fear. Because the unknown is power. You don't react, you respond, consciously or not at all. Triggering you used to be easy. A comment, a tone, an insult, and you were in the ring. Now you see through provocation. You recognize projection. You observe ego without feeding it. A toxic person wants reaction, not resolution. And when you don't give it, they lose their weapon. They're left swinging at air, fighting a version of you that no longer exists. Your silence becomes a mirror. It forces them to face themselves, their insecurity, jealousy, emptiness. You win simply by refusing to play. The mystery is that you outgrew the battlefield entirely. The real fear isn't your silence. It's what your silence represents, that you healed, that you leveled up, that you became someone they can't access, manipulate, or diminish anymore. You're no longer fighting to be understood. You're building a life that speaks for itself. You don't chase closure, you create distance. You don't seek revenge, you evolve beyond the need for it. And that is what terrifies toxic people the most. Not your words, not your anger, but your evolution. You became the person they never expected you to become: calm, strategic, self-respecting, untouchable. Mystery isn't about hiding, it's about rising so quietly that those who once underestimated you must now watch from a distance with questions they will never get answers to. When you become unpredictable, you become unforgettable. Not because you're loud, but because your growth echoes louder than your voice ever could. This is the final silent behavior. You rise without noise, and your existence becomes the lesson. There is a type of power that doesn't shout, doesn't warn, doesn't threaten. It leaves quietly, finally, completely. This is the behavior toxic people fear the most. Not when you argue, not when you cry, not when you say, "I'm done." People don't fear words. They fear action without announcement. Because when someone leaves silently, it means a decision was made privately long before the moment they walked away. It means you detached emotionally first. You processed quietly. You saw everything: their patterns, excuses, manipulation cycles, and instead of demanding change, you chose yourself. You stopped waiting for apologies, stopped hoping they'd understand, stopped explaining your pain to people committed to causing it. You let go, not loudly, but smartly. Your silence signals a conclusion, not negotiation. Toxic people expect emotional reaction. They expect you to beg, argue, plead for respect, because that's how they maintain control, through drama and reactivity. But when you walk away without noise, something clicks in their mind. I no longer have access. No closure, no argument, no power exchange. Just a door closing, and they can't stop it. That quiet exit hits harder than any confrontation ever could, because finality without warning forces them to sit with themselves, and facing themselves is their greatest fear. You reclaim your energy instead of wasting it in conflict. Arguing with toxic people is like trying to teach fire not to burn. It's pointless and self-destructive. You finally learned what they were afraid you'd realize. You don't need closure to heal. You don't need permission to leave. Peace is something you choose, not negotiate. Walking away silently communicates emotional maturity and self-respect. Not revenge, not coldness, just clarity. Nothing is more intimidating than someone who is no longer controlled by their wounds. Your exit exposes everything their ego tried to hide. Your absence becomes a mirror. When you're no longer there to absorb blame, to cushion their insecurity, to carry the emotional weight of the connection, they are left alone with themselves. The silence reveals the disrespect they normalized, the love they mishandled, the access they wasted, the value they only recognize when it's gone. You don't have to prove your worth. They feel it when you're no longer available to provide it. You don't leave to hurt them. You leave because you outgrew the space they kept you confined in. And growth is something the toxic cannot control. You send a message without speaking a word. Silence communicates what 100 arguments never could. I'm done trying to make you understand. My peace matters more than this connection. I won't shrink to be tolerated. You lost access not because I hate you, but because I love myself. Walking away quietly is the final evolution of emotional intelligence. Because the moment you stop trying to change them, you change the entire dynamic. You free yourself, and you force them to face consequences they thought would never come. Your disappearance becomes unforgettable. It's ironic when you were available. They didn't value you. Now that you're gone, they can't stop thinking about you. They replay conversations, rewrite memories, invent reasons, search for closure you refuse to provide. Your silence forces them to answer their own questions. Why did you leave? Why didn't you fight? Why didn't you come back? Were you stronger than they thought? Yes, you were. You stopped bleeding for people who wouldn't even hand you a bandage. Nothing terrifies a toxic person more than realizing the person they tried to break is now whole without them. You disappear into growth, not bitterness. You didn't vanish to seek revenge. You vanished to rebuild, to evolve, to bloom where they never expected you to rise. You glow quietly, working, healing, leveling up in silence. No announcement, no validation quest, just progress. And suddenly they notice. You look happier. You speak wiser. You shine softer but stronger. You're unreachable in a way you never were before. They didn't fear losing you when they had you. They fear losing access to the version of you they took for granted. And that's the silent punishment growth delivers. Without revenge, without war, without a single word, only distance, evolution, radiance. This is the 8th behavior. You walk away without noise, without warning, without collapse. You exit like a door closing, slowly but permanently, and the echo of silence does all the talking. Because when you stop responding, stop explaining, stop returning, they finally understand. You were the blessing, not the one who needed saving. Now you understand power isn't in raising your voice. Power is when you no longer need to. You don't intimidate toxic people because you're louder, but because you're quieter, stronger within, unaffected, unreachable. Your silence became your shield. Your boundaries became your armor. Your absence became the lesson they never saw coming. Remember this, you don't win by fighting. You win by outgrowing. You win by not responding. You win by walking away with your soul intact. And when you master these 8 silent behaviors, you won't need revenge. Your peace is the revenge. Your growth is the closure. Your aura is the message. So, if this video resonated with you, if you felt that shift in your spirit, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. Because we are building a community of minds who move differently, stronger quietly, wiser inwardly, calm but dangerous in silence. Before you go, comment below, "My silence is power." Let's see how many warriors are walking this path with you tonight. Your future self is watching, and trust me, they're proud,